Every system, no matter how perfect it's lauded to be, harbors a dark underbelly that those within it are too slow to perceive. This sentiment isn't explicitly stated in Michael Lewis's Flash Boys asterisk, but its spirit permeates every page, flowing like an underground current beneath the city's concrete. Lewis chronicles the journey of individuals who discover that the financial market, often seen as the epitome of transparency, is in fact controlled by invisible milliseconds subterranean networks that most of the world remains utterly unaware of. What happens, then, when truth doesn't collapse with a loud crash, but with minuscule fluctuations? Only those patient enough will grasp the story within this book, which unveils a world where speed equates to power, where a delay of mere milliseconds is enough to shift billions of dollars, and where seemingly neutral human decisions inadvertently forge an environment that no one fully comprehends anymore. In this context, Flash Boys doesn't merely recount an investigation. It poses an unavoidable question. Can a system genuinely maintain fairness when its very operators no longer understand how it functions? When a small group can see the market before the rest of the world, does that market still reflect true value or merely the advantage of those who are faster? And if the greatest market distortions stem from the tiniest details, a straighter cable segment, a discrete priority router, a single millisecond bought for the price of an entire building, where do listeners of this story position themselves on that map? As passive victims, or as individuals astute enough to perceive what has long been taken for granted? This book offers no simple answers, but it opens a door to peer into the submerged part of the market, and indeed, the submerged parts of our own minds. And from that doorway, the most crucial question emerges. What else in life is operating in ways we are too slow to recognize? There are secrets not hidden in darkness, but laid bare in plain sight, for all to see yet never truly comprehend. The creation of a cable line running straight across America, so straight it defied mountains, rivers, and harsh terrain, was precisely such a secret. It didn't glow, make noise, nor bore the hallmarks of those accustomed to flaunting their power. It merely lay silent beneath the earth, like a patient creature awaiting activation at the opportune moment. I remember the early days when the construction teams fanned out, small groups of a few people working so silently that even they didn't know what was rising from the earth beneath their feet. They were given only one instruction, repeated like a mantra: don't ask, don't tell. And if anyone got curious, they were simply to say they were laying cable. This ambiguity transformed their work into a mystical ritual rather than a mere infrastructure project. Drills cut through blue stone, trenches snaked across fields, powerful punches broke through steel-hard soil. All served a single, perfect straight line, so straight that even a minor curve was considered a failure. When I first saw the map, the soft curves of existing cable routes looked like an easy compromise. They detoured around towns, hugged railway lines, skirted mountains, following human logic, not the logic of speed. But I was haunted by a question. If the most valuable commodity wasn't the path, but time, then why accept those arcs that stretched out milliseconds meaninglessly, when a straight line could cut over 100 miles? And in a world where every millionth of a second has a price, that distance wasn't just geographical, it was real money. I hired a car and a local worker to drive along that imaginary route. 2 days we roamed, passing through towns with only one gas station, on roads so narrow that at night, you needed high beams just to see the edge of the asphalt. Everywhere, I saw a strange, wild beauty. Nature seemed to deliberately erect obstacles, as if to ask whether humans had the patience to carve out time. Every time the map showed a break in the line, I'd spend hours trying to straighten it. Because I understood that speed wasn't a byproduct of technology, it was what technology had to kneel down and serve. What tormented me wasn't the technical risks, but the feeling that I was touching a fold in the financial market that few dared to look at directly. On the surface, the stock exchange maintained an orderly facade, as if everything was under control. But deep beneath that surface was a silent race, one where the losers didn't even know they were competing. It didn't take long for me to grasp that if this path was completed, its power wouldn't lie in the cable itself, but in the invisible gap between those who knew and those who didn't. When the project secured funding, everything shifted to the tone of an expedition. The permits required to dig through each county were akin to convincing an ancient land to let a new creature burrow beneath its skin. Some places were welcoming, others hostile. Many thought we were part of a secret government organization, and strangely, that reassured them more than acknowledging it was a private venture. I didn't tell them that the financial world could sometimes be more secretive than any intelligence agency. When the cable line reached the bluestone regions of Pennsylvania, construction slowed to a mere few hundred feet a day. Drills bounced off the rock-hard layers as if striking a final period. But for us, no period was acceptable. To go around meant losing precious microseconds, and in the market, microseconds had become the very breath of machines. It meant an advantage. It meant whoever controlled the microseconds controlled the power to dictate prices. I once heard a drill operator wonder why we had to bore through mountains instead of circling them. I couldn't answer him with terms like signal propagation effect or arbitrage speed. How could I explain that sometimes time itself is a tool of power, and that if we didn't cut through the heart of the mountain, we would never reach the intersection of physics and finance? When traders first heard about the cable line, their reaction said it all. Not surprise, but fear, thinly veiled beneath a veneer of calm. They immediately understood one thing: what we were building wasn't infrastructure, it was an advantage. And that advantage, once activated, would transform how prices moved in the market, too fast for the human eye to follow. We hadn't told them that the line hadn't reached its endpoint yet, and its journey, along with the secret it carried, would delve even deeper into corners previously thought to be random, harmless, or simply technical limitations. We had reached the first frontier of speed. But what awaited beyond, within the trading systems that humans were gradually losing control of, was where the true quest for understanding would begin. That subterranean path, after piercing through bluestone as hard as sealed memories, began to unleash consequences we foresaw, but couldn't prevent. The project's absolute secrecy meant that connection points and signal amplification stations had to be erected like solitary fortresses, scattered among countless unnamed towns. In some places, we encountered strange reservations. Landowners feared the cable would become a target for attack, or that their neighborhoods would become the epicenter of an unnamed danger. They didn't know that the most frightening thing wasn't the technology, but the people willing to pay any price to get ahead of others by the smallest fraction of a second. As we neared New Jersey, the path exacted an ever greater price for each absolute straight segment. Even a slight bend made me feel as though I was betraying the original objective. The next obstacle was the eastern bank of a river so wide that laying a cable beneath it seemed unimaginable. But without crossing it, all the effort from Chicago to Pennsylvania would be meaningless. We found a way, not by embracing reckless risk, but by tracing the faint outline of an old, abandoned tunnel, nearly half a century old. In its darkness, there was a strange feeling, as if human endeavors always had an invisible infrastructure waiting, just for someone patient enough to find it. When we reached Sunbury, everything virtually halted. Only a small stretch of land remained for us to cross, connecting the two ends of the cable line. But this land belonged to an old steel cable factory. The local people's distrust wasn't caution. It was born from years of being harmed by industrial projects they were powerless to stop. So, they refused, and our project suddenly stood still at a strange frontier between engineering and human anxiety. Everything seemed destined to dissolve into thin air until the silence was broken, and the landowner, for reasons unknown, agreed. Sometimes, people don't fully understand why they open their land for a journey to pass through it. But for us, it was a sign that the time for the secret to emerge into the light had come. As soon as the cable line was completed, the reaction from the trading world was like the compressed sound of a huge wave that no one would acknowledge. But they all understood. They had just lost their position in the speed race. The only thing they wanted to ask was if they could buy this advantage back. But an advantage, once commodified, ceases to be an advantage. The buyers weren't just seeking a cable line, they sought a key to unlock a new level of power. And the sellers knew well that power couldn't be distributed equally. While the worlds of technology and finance impacted each other like two overlapping geological plates in Manhattan. Another person was grappling with a phantom he couldn't yet name. Brad, born in Canada into a culture that valued directness, stepped into the American trading world like someone entering a brightly lit room but unable to find the switch. He was accustomed to transparency, believing that the prices on the screen were the truth, until the day the truth began to behave like an illusion. The first time his buy order vanished before his eyes, he thought it was a machine error. The second time, he thought perhaps he himself was mistaken, but by the third time, he understood he was facing something far more alive. When he pressed the button, the price changed before his order even reached the market. No one could explain it. The engineers saw him as a nuisance. They said it was because many other orders were interjecting, but Brad knew coincidence never persisted like that. He pulled each engineer behind him and showed them the truth. He counted every second, every breath. When he pressed a key, the market vanished as if someone had heard his thoughts. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just being outmaneuvered. He was being observed, not by humans, but by a system that reacted so quickly it could be mistaken for intuition. What bothered him most wasn't the losses, but the feeling that the market had silently changed without anyone announcing it. Strategies that had worked for years became useless in a matter of months. Everything he had learned about how the market reacted, how liquidity appeared, how prices moved all became outdated memories. He was doing a job that no longer existed in the sense he understood. Then came the day BC merged with Kalen, and cultural chaos descended like a storm. The flashy show-offs placed their polished shoes on the table as a sign that anything was possible. Meanwhile, the trading system they brought with them was riddled with holes. It was fast on the surface but soulless at its core. Brad was forced to use it, and when errors appeared, the blame fell on him. But it was precisely that helplessness that opened another door. The repeated glitches on the screen, the sudden disappearance of prices, the inexplicable reactions all formed an invisible map that only the patient could see. Brad didn't give up, not out of confidence, but because he couldn't accept working in a system he didn't understand. His job demanded that he understand, and it was this imperative that drove him to dig deeper into a territory that everyone else had ignored. He didn't yet know that what he was seeing was only the surface, and the path to the rest of the truth would only open when he met the one person capable of explaining the language that speed employed. Brad's confusion didn't vanish over time. It merely settled like sediment at the bottom of a glass, waiting to be stirred up by a small detail powerful enough to shatter every assumption he had once believed. He knew he was missing a piece, something that could explain why his seemingly harmless orders created a chain reaction across the market. But he couldn't fathom that this missing piece wasn't found in the financial world, but in the world of those who pursued speed as a form of truth. Ronan entered this story in the way that people who truly understand themselves often do, without fanfare, without seeking attention, yet carrying a depth of knowledge that could fundamentally alter the problem. He grew up in a family with no ties to finance. His journey took him through network companies, infrastructure providers, and cable routes that most traders had never even heard of. He understood the physical location of each exchange, the length of every transmission line, and the exact time each signal packet needed to arrive, as if it were the topographical map of his own body. The difference between Brad and Ronan lay here. Brad saw the market on a computer screen, while Ronan saw the market beneath it. He knew that nothing was truly simultaneous in the world of data. Each exchange was in a different location. Each route traveled a different distance, and every millisecond swallowed by an extra few meters of cable became a pricing decision upon which millions of dollars depended. Brad met Ronan not by chance, but because he had reached a threshold where he couldn't understand any more without stepping into a different world. In their very first conversation, when Brad spoke of the disappearing orders, Ronan showed no surprise. He didn't view it as a strange phenomenon, but as the inevitable consequence of the new market structure. Brad looked at him, and for the first time felt that someone wasn't just listening, but was capable of translating the incomprehensible into explanations. Ronan explained that it wasn't the market moving ahead of Brad, but rather the physical distance between exchanges that created gaps, which others knew how to exploit. When Brad sent an order from New York, that order had to travel a certain distance to reach one exchange, then another. But there were teams with machines placed right next to order processing centers, fast enough to see Brad's signal and react before his order could reach its destination. They weren't reading his thoughts, but they were reading speed, and speed was a more honest language than anything else. Ronan presented numbers Brad had never heard anyone discuss. Delays of several hundred microseconds between two exchanges, the difference between a looped cable route and a straight one, the time it took for a signal to pass through some old, unnoticed router. What seemed like trivial details turned out to be the foundation for a system that operated on distance, where whoever knew the shorter path would see the market before anyone else. Brad gradually realized he wasn't being deceived. He was simply viewing the market from the perspective of someone who believed in synchronization, but the market wasn't synchronized. It was fragmented into dozens of trading centers, each reacting to its own rhythm. And those who thought like Ronan had understood for years that being just one beat ahead was enough to seize the entire advantage. From that moment, an underground current in Brad's thoughts began to flow in a different direction. He no longer viewed what he saw as errors. He began to see it as the consequence of a design beneficial to those who understood speed better and detrimental to those who believed everything was managed fairly. The delay wasn't a glitch. It was a resource. And that resource was being exploited by teams who didn't appear in the headlines but wielded power beyond imagination. Ronan told Brad about the high-speed trading firms he had encountered. They asked him for the fastest routes to each exchange. They bought every shorter meter of cable, every faster converter, every space closer to data centers. They built systems that reacted in timeframes the human brain couldn't perceive, and they exploited every loophole to get ahead of the large investors for whom they were ostensibly providing liquidity. Brad listened, feeling a discomfort both familiar and strange creep across his chest. It wasn't fear, but the clarity of someone who knew he had stepped into a dark territory he had vaguely sensed for a long time but couldn't name. His disappearing orders weren't signs of random chaos, but proof that the market had been reshaped by those who wielded speed as a weapon. And it was right there, where the truth was revealed, that Brad not only understood more about what he faced. He understood that from this moment on, he would never again view the market as a neutral machine. It was a living body with weaknesses, gaps, and blood vessels that the cunning could infiltrate. And like any other body, it could be hijacked if those who needed it most were the ones who understood it least. The conversation with Ronan, instead of ending Brad's confusion, opened a new objective. If speed was being exploited to push the market off its true course, could speed itself help him bring it back on track? An initial thought, just a small spark, but in the echo of a myriad of unanswered questions, it began to become the only possible direction. That meeting would create a change greater than a single cable segment, greater than a trading group, and greater even than the idea that the market was a place where everyone looked in the same direction. They only knew that from this moment on, microseconds were not just a unit of signal measurement. They were a unit of power, and they had to find a way to reclaim it before others used it to lock the market's doors behind all the remaining investors. Brad once thought the market operated on predictable principles. With enough expertise and experience, one could understand price movements and investor reactions. But the truth revealed after relentless searching was far more brutal. He and those by his side had created something they called a weapon, a tool to protect investors from a force hidden behind speed. However, they understood very little about the predator that weapon targeted, as if looking at the shadow of an animal without knowing its species, its danger, or how to track it in the jungle of wires, trading orders, and silently operating connections. Ironically, the more they investigated, the more they realized that most people working in large financial institutions didn't even understand the system they relied upon. What Brad learned through hundreds of conversations only reinforced his sense of unease. There was a colossal machinery standing between buyers and sellers, about which even industry insiders had only a superficial grasp. People worked with data sequences, software, and order processing systems. But behind them were rules that no one saw in their entirety. They touched the market's surface, but were vague about the movements decided beneath. Ronan was the first to open the door to that territory for Brad, but what Ronan knew was only a piece of a larger puzzle. Therefore, Brad had to broaden his search. He met people who had left major banks after periods of volatility. Many of them had held important roles but didn't fully understand the system they operated daily. The red thread running through all those conversations was a feeling of fear and a lack of faith in the very machine they served as if they were living in a city where water pipes had been buried underground for generations, and everyone just hoped they wouldn't burst. Among those people was Scott, a man with a calm demeanor but harboring deep skepticism. He was born into a family involved in firefighting, where danger was tangible, and people endured it with steadfastness. He chose a different path, studying engineering, entering finance, and then becoming the person in the middle of groups where everyone thought they held the decision-making power. He wasn't the one making trades, but the one who had to understand every minute detail of them to ensure all regulations were followed. His work wasn't considered central, but it was the foundation for the machinery to operate correctly. Scott saw the market's transformation from the very first signals, not from price charts, but from regulatory loopholes. Small adjustments, whether accidental or intentional, created conditions for speed to interject and dominate everything. He didn't complain or boast, but Brad recognized in his demeanor a very specific weariness, the weariness of someone observing the system from within, understanding that it was slipping in a direction no one wanted to admit. It wasn't hard to realize that what they were trying to track down wasn't a group of rivals, but a creature nourished by speed, reaching out from exchanges, burrowing through cable lines, weaving through data packets passing through routers. It had no face, no name, nor did it belong to a specific organization. It was the natural result of distorted rules, the product of small system adjustments that made speed an absolute advantage. What confused Brad most wasn't the system's complexity, but how it turned humans into mere adjuncts to a machine they themselves didn't understand. Everyone he met shared a common thread. They were swept into the current of new technology and structure, and everyone felt as if they were standing beside a massive wave, unsure when it would crash down. Ronan led Brad deeper into layers of the system he had only seen from afar before. But despite understanding latency and speed, despite knowing that orders were fragmented and exchanges optimized to serve those fast enough, Brad still couldn't imagine the vastness of the network the Predator used to eavesdrop on the market. These ultra-fast groups not only had technical knowledge, they also had special relationships with the exchanges, ties that outsiders could barely perceive. Speed became something that, once possessed, would alter the trajectory of every trade. But the most frightening realization was still ahead when Brad began to understand that to track the Predator, he couldn't just look at numbers or cable lines. He had to look at people, at how they worked, at the motives driving them, and at the loopholes they either ignored or deliberately exploited. The disparate pieces began to take shape, and they understood that the Predator wasn't a shadow, but a composite of hundreds of small decisions made by many different individuals, forming a new structure whose power was beyond control. That pursuit wasn't a purely rational journey. It was the feeling of touching something quietly growing, and knowing that without understanding it, they would never be able to save the market they wanted to protect. What they found in their quest to unmask the Predator didn't lead to a simple answer. It opened up another layer of the world, where the people behind the speed operating the market weren't hidden in darkness, but twirled under the white lights of data centers, before hundreds of screens, amidst the hum of cooling fans and ceaselessly running code. That was where Brad had to confront a new truth. The Predator wasn't a mindless machine, but human beings with ambitions, skills, and ways of thinking completely different from anything he had ever known. He met young programmers, their eyes lighting up whenever they spoke of optimizing a short piece of code by a few nanoseconds. They didn't see themselves as market destroyers. In their minds, they were merely improving efficiency, exploiting the system's logic like a chess player finding a quicker move. They didn't talk about investors. They didn't talk about damages, nor did they question whose trade orders were being jumped. They spoke of speed the way an artist speaks of color or a blacksmith speaks of steel. Their words were both sharp and detached, but hidden within them was a pride in their ability to manipulate the tiniest movements of the market. Among the people Brad and his team met were faces that didn't carry the arrogance of traditional finance. They were quiet, sometimes a little quirky, but they understood the market with a depth that seasoned traders couldn't reach. When Brad asked them about their motives, They replied that they liked the elegance of the signal, the feeling of winning through speed, the satisfaction of seeing the market react to their will. What sent chills down Brad's spine wasn't what they boasted about, but what they didn't say. They didn't care about the consequences of speed for those who were slower. Meanwhile, in another corner of the market, figures who had once operated major exchanges began to reveal the system's fragility, and Brad clearly saw that speed had redefined everything. The person who impressed him most was an engineer with deep experience in operating electronic exchanges. He recounted an incident where he accidentally froze the entire market for 22 seconds, not because he intended to, but because just one incorrect line of code was enough to bring the entire system to a halt. That incident served as a mirror reflecting the nature of the modern market. It wasn't a solid, rationally controlled institution, but like a living organism, always harboring unpredictable breaking points. That individual then delved into studying complexity, understanding that a market couldn't be controlled with linear thinking, that every adjustment, no matter how small, created unpredictable chain reactions. Brad listened and realized why those who controlled speed were always ahead. They didn't need to understand the entire market. They only needed to understand how the system reacted in extremely short timeframes, where human intuition couldn't intervene. While Brad was finding people who could explain how the system operated, he discovered something even more frightening. Exchanges had silently transformed themselves to serve the very predators he was pursuing. Not because they wanted the market to be unfair, but because they were drawn into a new chain of economic incentives. An exchange needed to attract trading volume to survive. To have trading volume, they had to offer what high-speed firms coveted most: an advantage. They created proprietary data feeds, hidden corners in the order matching mechanism that ordinary people would never know about. At emerging companies like Bats and Direct Edge, small adjustments gradually turned into structures designed to favor groups capable of reacting faster than the market. And when this happened, older exchanges couldn't stand idly by. They began to emulate, seeking to retain high-frequency trading firms by selling them priority within the order structure. When Brad asked the people running these exchanges why they did this, they just shook their heads. No one dared to claim they fully understood what they were creating. They only knew that the market had changed, and they had to change with it. One person who had operated a large exchange admitted that these changes didn't stem from deep understanding but from pressure. Exchanges became public companies, having to report quarterly profits and show growth to shareholders in that environment. They no longer had time to think about the market's sustainability. They were only concerned with short-term revenues. If speed helped them sell more services, they would provide speed. If complexity made ultra-fast groups need them more, they would create more complexity. These accounts made Brad visualize the market as a forest being set ablaze from small points. The fire spread rapidly because the wind of profit blew through every branch, and the forest rangers were busy selling firewood. They weren't fighting the predator. They were nurturing it because their existence was bound to the needs of the very forces destroying the market. As the human pieces of the puzzle gradually became clearer, Brad saw that to understand the predator, he couldn't just view them as a system. He had to see them as a new kind of human being. People who saw opportunity in every millisecond and transformed latency into an asset. Although they didn't consider themselves malicious, their way of looking at the market made Brad question who truly controlled the heartbeat of modern finance. The more he learned, the more Brad felt he was facing an undeniable reality. The predator was no longer invisible. It had a face, a philosophy, a method. It existed in plain sight, right before everyone's eyes, but no one had enough time or motivation to fully see it, and to fight it, to understand it not just rationally, but with the ability to see through the technological veneer that concealed human motives. When the stories, the people, and the connections gradually coalesced into a distinct form, Brad knew that the next journey wouldn't just be a chase. It would be a quest to reclaim what had been silently stolen from the market. And it was at the threshold of that thought that he stepped through a new door, where the question was no longer, who is the predator? But how do we strip away the power that speed has bestowed upon them? As Brad and his team delved deep enough into the market structure, they began to feel like they were standing in a room with only one exit, and that exit was covered by a transparent pane of glass. They could see what was happening, understanding that a colossal flow of money was being siphoned from the market through gaps created by speed, but they couldn't yet touch the actual mechanism behind it. How to quantify the amount of money being taken each day was a question no one could answer frankly. But Brad knew that if they couldn't measure it, they would never have a chance to reclaim it. They started with small steps, analyzing every price movement, every market reaction when large orders appeared. The truth emerged like a submerged map beneath the numbers. Brad realized that in certain moments, a difference of just 1 millisecond could determine colossal sums of money. The value of 1 millisecond was no longer a technical concept, but a tangible asset, something that ultra-fast groups used to extract every penny from the pockets of those who believed they were trading fairly. A study they accessed showed that if someone controlled the fastest connection between two major trading centers, they would have the power to manipulate the price at one point by knowing the price at the other. Estimates indicated annual profits could reach tens of billions of dollars, a figure beyond the imagination of any traditional investor. This stunned Brad, not because the amount was so large, but because it existed right within a system everyone thought they clearly saw. As they dug deeper, the picture became painfully clear. The routers that investors relied on to send orders didn't work the way people thought. They didn't prioritize the best price, but rather the place that benefited the very bank that designed them. Trading orders were fragmented and then diverted along circuitous routes, as if evading an invisible ghost. What was actually happening was that high-speed trading groups had built an entire infrastructure to intercept investor orders. Brad looked at the data and realized something no one had dared to articulate in this system. No one truly represented the investors' interests. Exchanges competed by creating advantages for speed. Banks used routers optimized for their own benefit. Investors were merely the last in line, sending information to the market, but betrayed by the very conduits they paid to use. However, what troubled Brad wasn't the injustice, but the prolonged silence surrounding it. No one considered this an ethical problem. No one questioned whether the market still reflected true value. Speed had become the new norm, and once a norm is accepted, people stop scrutinizing it. Those who got ahead with speed didn't see themselves as wielding a knife. They simply thought they were exploiting the system's natural latency. Banks didn't see themselves as enablers. They were just trying to maintain profits in an increasingly competitive market. And investors were too trusting of the smooth surface of prices to realize what was being taken from them. When these discoveries were connected, Brad understood that the market wasn't just distorted. It was fundamentally flawed in its operating incentives. All significant players benefited when the market was more complex, more opaque, harder to understand. Complexity created opportunities to sell advantages, opacity created reasons for new products, and difficulty in understanding deprived investors of their right to question. In that structure, speed becoming a weapon was an inevitable outcome. Brad and his team realized they couldn't fix the market within outdated structures. They needed a new direction, not by defeating speed, but by stripping away its reason for existence. They needed to create a place where speed was no longer an advantage, where every trade entered the market in a way no one could eavesdrop on, predict, or exploit. But to do that, they faced a paradox. To fight the current market, they needed to understand it so deeply that they could rebuild it from its foundations. And the truth was, the more they understood it, the more they felt they were standing on the boundary between knowledge and skepticism. Brad realized that deeply understanding the market mechanism placed a responsibility on his shoulders that he couldn't refuse. If he didn't do anything, who would? Long meetings no longer revolved around, where is the market wrong? But shifted to, can we redesign a market not based on speed? Ronan mentioned intentional delays, something that could prevent ultra-fast groups from eavesdropping on orders. Others spoke of transparent order routing, forcing routers to behave as advertised. Each idea was just a small piece, but they fit together to form the shape of something no one had ever attempted. Brad looked around the room, at the people who had followed him throughout the journey to unmask the predator. They weren't those empowered by the market. They didn't possess speed. They didn't have superior technological advantages, but they had something the predators didn't: the ability to see the market as something that needed to be saved, not something to be exploited. The journey to build a fair market where speed was disarmed, where investors were no longer the last to know what was happening, and where truth was restored to its rightful place. That morning, Zoran boarded the subway as usual, but the atmosphere was thick with an unnamed strangeness. Commuters typically avoided eye contact, yet that day, everyone whispered short exchanges, as if a collective intuition had preceded explanation. He didn't yet know that the world above ground was about to crack open, but the crowd's unease foreshadowed it. The memory of a critical 11-month period became a turning point for his entire life, not just because he witnessed a dark day, but because it pulled him from the safe zone of an engineer behind a screen and placed him in a position where every mistake could cause real chaos. After that event, he realized the system he operated was no longer a cluster of machines running stably according to textbook theories. It was like a stubborn organism, reacting in unpredictable ways. And then, on a seemingly normal day, he accidentally crashed an entire market for several dozen seconds, only to have to restart it under the immense pressure of thousands of eyes behind trading orders. In that very moment, he understood that the market was never just charts and figures. It was a complex system where every small change was capable of creating a chain reaction. That shock propelled him to delve into the nature of complexity, reading books he had never thought he would touch. He learned about nonlinear systems, where cause and effect weren't directly linked, where stability was merely a thin veneer over a structure constantly on the verge of chaos. The more he read, the more he saw the market as a fragile ecosystem, entirely unlike the ideal machine many still imagined. He saw reflected in it his own work, standing between humanity and technology, trying to maintain a balance that was never truly sustainable. When looking back on his journey, Zoran realized that people like him were not few lonely individuals within the system, carrying the feeling that the market was drifting off its rightful course. Ronan brought a keen sense of speed. Scott saw the distortions in the operating structure. John felt the skewing of new economic incentives. They lived in separate fragments, unaware that these quiet doubts formed an invisible thread connecting them. Brad appeared in their lives like a collector of these fragments. He didn't speak harshly, nor did he act like someone holding the ultimate truth, but he listened with a sincerity that made the other person realize their long-held thoughts weren't mere delusions. They began to converge around Brad, not because he held power, but because he showed them that their loneliness was shared. However, at this point, everything was still just scattered thoughts. No one dared to say what they would do next. They only knew the market was becoming a maze, and the smartest people were being drawn into expanding the maze rather than simplifying it. They also understood that speed, praised by many, was becoming the root of a power no one dared to name correctly. But understanding wasn't enough. They needed action, a step out of their comfort zone to turn their suspicions into an answer. Zoran, late at night, sitting before the system he had once accidentally crashed, began to clearly feel that he no longer fit the role of just a technical cog. The obsession with the market's fragility transformed into a driving force pushing him further. He saw himself as an old lighthouse keeper, knowing it was about to collapse, but forced to keep its light on for passing ships, even if that light might lead them to submerged rocks. Brad, meanwhile, saw the market as a land to be saved rather than a battlefield to be conquered. The discussions between him, Ronan, Scott, and John gradually took on the shape of something larger than an investigation. They no longer just sought to understand how the market was being distorted, but began to think about whether they could build a different marketplace, not run by those who controlled speed, where the path of trade orders was no longer bent like a shadow underwater. But to touch that dream, they had to confront the truth that each of them was in a stable position, with reputation, income, family, and commitments. Separating from the system wasn't like changing jobs, it was like leaving a world they had spent years understanding. That fear wasn't something they acknowledged, but the silence in many conversations spoke volumes. Yet, the more they observed the market, the more they felt an ember deep inside them ignite. Zoran carried scars from the past, proof that the system's fragility couldn't be ignored. Ronan understood that speed would continue to tear the market apart if no one stood up to stop it. Scott saw the legal landscape being twisted to serve the new structure. And Brad, who had once painfully witnessed the market betraying his clients' trade orders, began to visualize more clearly the future they could create. These invisible threads pulled them closer. the underground currents finally met before flowing into the open sea. The team didn't officially exist yet, but its seeds pulsed within each story, each glance, each time they realized that none of them wanted to stand still anymore. And as the darkness of the old market deepened, they felt one thing clearly. To change something that was wavering, they had to rebuild it from its foundations. That was the moment the idea of a new place, a different playing field, began to glimmer, a place where complexity wasn't meant to conceal advantages, but to protect fairness. A place where speed wasn't a weapon, but merely a tool. A place where individuals who had once been lonely in their doubts could now stand together, looking in the same direction. As their conversations grew more frequent, the initial ambiguity slowly transformed into determination. The first thing that changed wasn't the market, but the people. Brad understood that if he didn't step out of the framework the bank had built around him, he wouldn't be able to convince anyone to believe in a new path. His position in the old place was still safe, but that safety had become too tight a shirt. He decided to leave BC. It was a quiet decision, but it carried the weight of the first pickaxe strike into the ground where they would build something entirely new. Leaving a familiar place wasn't easy. It was like moving from light into darkness, except this darkness lay within the very thoughts he had harbored for so long. But he knew he couldn't do anything else when he looked back at the disappearing prices, the exploited transmission lines, the structures warped by speed. He understood that if he stayed, he would merely be an onlooker, watching the market skew without being able to do anything. Brad began to meet with each person in his small group. Every conversation started with a brief silence, as if each person was pondering the unspoken question, "Do I dare to leave this place?" None of them were recklessly daring. They all understood what they were sacrificing: their jobs, income, reputation, the stability they had spent years building. But they also knew that if they didn't act, no one else would act for them. Ronan was the first to answer. He didn't need more time to deliberate, for he had already seen the market controlled by speed in ways ordinary people couldn't imagine. For him, this wasn't an adventure, but a continuation of the thoughts he had carried since counting every millisecond on the transmission map. He knew well that the speed predator couldn't be defeated by its own speed. What was needed wasn't to be faster, but to be smarter. Scott was different. He had lived too long in the ambiguous space between legality and reality, where regulations were written by people who believed the system was stable. He knew it was no longer stable. Every time he witnessed the market being distorted without anyone being able to prove it, he felt like a log keeper on a tilting ship, but no one was reading his notes. That very fact gave Brad's invitation special weight. He didn't join because he wanted to rebel, but because he wanted a place where transparency was no longer an exception. John, who had seen the dark side of exchanges, understood that this path would cost him many things. He had seen the hidden corners where price was no longer price, where advantages were sold like commodities. He knew that to stand up against that structure, they needed more than courage. But what he realized most profoundly was that if they didn't start now, the market would continue to be swallowed by the interests of groups faster than everyone else. Finally, he nodded. And so, one by one, they embarked on a journey whose outcome they couldn't envision. They met in a small room, without luxurious glass doors or bank logos, only sketches piled high on a piece of paper. Brad wrote a sentence: "If speed is the problem, then let's make it meaningless." That statement was like a manifesto for a group of people who no longer wanted the market to be dominated by milliseconds that the majority never even saw. From there, they began to establish principles that had never existed in any exchange. No selling of speed advantages, no preferential treatment for any group, transparent order routing, intentional delays to neutralize speed predators. These rules sounded simple, but demanded that they break down the entire logic currently operating the market. They didn't want to compete with faster technology. They wanted to eradicate the reason why that technology became a weapon. Zoran played a crucial role at this time. With all his understanding of complex systems, he designed the infrastructure architecture for the new venue. He knew that even a small logical loophole would be exploited by speed predators. Therefore, he built everything from scratch, borrowing no code from existing exchanges, replicating no old processes. He said that if they wanted to change the market, they had to start from foundations untainted by old ways of thinking. Their meetings lacked a formal atmosphere. Everyone sat close, like artisans building a house in a valley. Each idea offered was like a brick. Brad observed the group and realized something special. This was no longer one man's army. They had become each other's army. They didn't need anyone to push them. The concern for the market had become their motivation. The desire to build a fair place had become their glue, and each person's understanding of a dark corner of the market became a guiding light for the entire team. Each time they met, they would pose another open question. If we build this, can it survive in a world of speed? Will it be attacked by the very forces we want to neutralize? But it was these questions that bound them closer. They didn't delude themselves into having immediate answers. They only knew they were getting closer to the form of the new place. Like pathfinders in a fog, they couldn't see far, but each step forward revealed a new patch of light. Then came a day when the entire team looked at the first complete blueprint that Zoran and Ronan had put together. They knew that their direction was no longer just on paper. They were standing before the foundation of a new exchange, a place where speed would no longer hold power. A place where investors would no longer have to guess who was eavesdropping on them. A place capable of remaking the market at the very point where it began to go astray. That moment brought no applause, no grand pronouncements, only the silence of people who had just seen the future they wanted to build. And in that silence, they understood that the next journey would take them out of the shadow of doubt and directly into the light that exposed every strand of the web entangling the market. When the blueprint for the new place had taken shape, they set to building not a symbol, but a real structure that could stand in a world saturated with speed. They understood that when their exchange became operational, it would be like a small boat launching into waters where huge waves constantly sought to sink anything that went against the current. But they also knew that if they didn't try, the market would never have a chance to see its own reflection. From the very first days, when the place just opened, they faced the toughest question: how to convince investors that transparency wasn't a luxury. IEX, presumably the new exchange, began to peel back the dark layers that the market had grown accustomed to. One by one, as they showed investors abnormal price movements that they could explain with data, those who once believed the market was merely random finally understood that something had been quietly siphoning from them, a little bit each day, for a long time. The initial meetings with large funds took place in an atmosphere of suspicion. Their counterparts were used to living in the old ecosystem. They didn't believe that this small group could clearly see the hidden networks running beneath the market. But when the charts were projected, the path of each order explained, and the exploited latencies clearly pointed out, they fell silent in a way that people only do when confronted with raw truth. The strategies of dark pool exploitation were exposed for the first time, especially the front-running typical of latency arbitrage, where ultra-fast groups used information from slower orders to perfectly, almost impossibly, jump ahead. Brad and his team didn't resort to condemnation. They simply presented the data and let the funds draw their own conclusions. When they showed how a trading group could make millions of dollars in a few hours just by eavesdropping on price signals from other venues, no one could still call it the market's natural logic. What unfolded was like people finally seeing the network that they had previously only sensed through minor price fluctuations. The market suddenly appeared as a spiderweb in which investors were inadvertently entangled not because they were naive, but because the web was woven from the very infrastructure they trusted. While IEX was exposing one dark layer after another story was unfolding elsewhere, also revealing the market's nature, but in a stranger and more bitter way. The trial of Igor, a programmer who was silently turned into the center of a manhunt. He was accused of stealing source code from his old workplace, but what made the story symbolic wasn't the accusation, but the fact that those judging him hardly understood what he did for a living. They asked questions that astonished anyone who had ever written code questions that showed they thought of technology as a simple object that could be held in hand and reversed with a few inquiries. That trial wasn't just about one man, it was about an entire legal system trying to judge a world it didn't comprehend. As arguments were made, as experts testified but described technology in ways that left even engineers speechless, the market was stripped bare once more. Power lay in the hands of those who didn't understand how power operated, and that made the web even thicker, for the flies caught in it could no longer see a way out. The story of Igor, paralleled with the journey of IEX, created a strange contrast. On one side, a man crushed by the system because no one understood the language he spoke. On the other, people trying to speak the market's own complex and ever-changing language. One was judged by opacity, the other was fighting against that same opacity. As IEX operated for several more months, the first numbers emerged, and they weren't just data, they were signs that the market still had hope. IEX led in adherence to standard prices, surpassing even the large, long-dominant exchanges. Skeptical investors began sending more orders. They saw there not speed, not advantage, but honesty in how orders were processed. And that honesty, when placed at the center, became powerful in a way no ultra-fast line of code could defeat. But initial success didn't bring relief to Brad and his team. They knew that what they were challenging was larger than a specific group or a specific strategy. They were confronting the entire structure that had allowed the market to be distorted, a structure from which exchanges, banks, and ultra-fast groups all benefited. Their opponent didn't have a single face. It wore many forms, many methods, and many motives. Nevertheless, in their darkest moments, they still saw something they didn't easily admit. They had done what many in the industry believed was impossible. Not because they were stronger than anyone, but because they chose to see the market not as a place to gain an advantage, but as a place that needed to be healed from its own misguided evolution. What made their journey resilient wasn't resistance, but the spirit that believed even a small light could expose a vast web. They couldn't erase all the sprawling networks, but they could create a corner of light for investors to see the path that had been obscured from them. And sometimes, just one corner of light is enough to shake an entire structure. As IEX continued to operate, as more investors began to route orders to them, as older exchanges started to feel the pressure to become more transparent, they understood that their journey wasn't over. But they also knew that the first step exposing the spiderweb beneath the market's surface had truly taken place. At the end of this journey, there was no triumphant victory or joyful cheers, only the quiet stillness of people who knew that what they were doing had changed a part of the world they lived in. And in that stillness, they realized that they were no longer lonely individuals within the system. They had become a cornerstone for all who believed that the market could be fairer, more transparent, and less cruel.